That's great. It's good to see where folks are joining from tonight. Again, thank you all for being here and for taking some time out of your evening. We are still admitting folks into the room, and we'll give folks the opportunity to join here. And just glad to see that we already have Knox Foster is in the room here. And from I was going to say you get the award here, Knox, coming from Canada to join us tonight, but originally from Beaufort. We love Knox and Knox's family. It's good to see you and good to see so many different folks joining. My name is Chase Glenn. I use he, him pronouns. I am the executive director of the Alliance for Full Acceptance, AFFA, based here in Charleston. And just really grateful for the opportunity to get together with you all tonight to share some space, share some information, and hopefully, from my perspective, a lot of times, the anxiety that I feel in moments is because there is a lack of information. And so I think my hope tonight is partly that we can share a little bit more about some of the things that you may have seen, read about in the news, seen in the national news, share some more information, how it might really impact you in your daily life with those you love. Um, and be able to be a resource that maybe provides a little bit of clarity, but also maybe some comfort at the same time and some hope. Um, so at AFFA, I'm just going to say just briefly here, our focus, we have a 501(c)(3) and a 501(c)(4). And our 501(c)(3) is really focused on education and resource sharing, community awareness building. We do media campaigns around certain issues. And it's really about, helping sort of, I mean, we've always said from the beginning, changing hearts and minds, and that really does still resonate. And we also have a 501(c)(4) that's more focused on political action and legislative issues and lobbying. Um, but I know where I'm not, where my specialty does not lie, and it does not lie in any sort of legal analysis. And so that's why I'm really grateful that we have partners like the ACLU of South Carolina who do have that sort of expertise, who are able to shed light on many of the issues that I think so many of us have been concerned about since the inauguration when Trump's executive orders began to roll out. And so I reached out to Jace Woodrum from the ACLU a few weeks ago and said, is there, a space for this or a need for this where, we could just provide a little more information, maybe help people feel like they're getting, more of a clear picture about what's going on. And most importantly, I think know their rights in these times, because what is frightening is feeling powerless and uninformed. And so hopefully tonight will help you feel a little more informed and then also experience and know your power in this. And I believe wholeheartedly that our power, part of our power, is in our community, in our support for one another, in being together, whether that's in a virtual space or in person. And so, with that, I am really grateful that we are able to share this time together and that I have Jace Woodrum here with us tonight and the ACLU co hosting this program with us. So, tonight we're going to go through basically everything we said we were going to go through. We're going to cover, the executive orders that have been handed down. I'll say that sort of like they've been like decrees, but what those mean, sort of the analysis of these sort of key issues, the key actions that impact LGBTQ plus people, um, your rights in these situations, and then also finally just advocating for yourself. And we want to give space for questions also. So encourage you that this is to be interactive. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. And we'll try to keep an eye on them. If we don't get to them right in the moment, I will do my best to also make a note of them so that we will circle back. But we do want this to be conversational and you feel like you're getting what you need out of our time together. So I will stop talking now, and I'd love to hand it over to my good friend Jace Woodrum from the ACLU of South Carolina.
Thanks, Chase. Hey, everybody. Really great to be with you. As Chase said, and yeah, our names are super confusing. And yeah, we have the same hairstyle. So if you confuse us, know that you are not the first and unlikely to be the last. but I do everything that Chase asks me to do. He's a friend in this work and in life, and so honored to share space with him and with all of you. I use he, him. I am the executive director of the ACLU of South Carolina. I'm also a transgender man, and I'm also a dad, and I'm a South Carolinian, so there's a lot to me. But today I'll be playing the role of executive director of ACLU of South Carolina, and a colleague of mine who is an attorney is going to join us a little bit later for those sort of phone and attorney questions that may come up. Even though I run the ACLU, I'm not an attorney and try not to pretend to be one all too often. Chase, any other preamble before we test my screen sharing abilities?
I think now's the time to test your screen sharing abilities.
Okay, here we go. Okay, Jensen, how we doing?
You did it.
We're good. All right.
It
Thank
looks
you
beautiful.
for the technological support. Okay, so we're going to talk about Trump's executive orders, and I just want to start by saying this is going to be heavy and hard. And so if you feel rage, sadness, and despair, take care of yourself. Take a step away, put something in the chat, reach out to a friend on text, do what you need to do because some of the stuff we're going to go through is really hard. Know that you are not alone in the hard. And I want to also begin by reminding us of what an executive order is, which it's not a law, it is not a court ruling, it is something that the executive branch, namely the president, can do that directs what the federal government does, how the federal government enforces laws. So Trump can sign an executive order to tell the Department of Health and Human Services to do something, to tell the Department of Defense to do something. That does not mean it can overrule the laws that Congress makes. It cannot end those laws. It cannot overrule court decisions. And that is why, if you've been tracking the news, many of his executive orders, both impacting trans people and not impacting trans people, have been challenged and blocked by the courts as unconstitutional, or at least potentially unconstitutional, such that they should not be enforced until the courts hear the arguments that are at play. So this is really a classic example of government overreach. At my last count, Trump had signed a little over 65 executive orders, and a great many of them are being challenged in the courts. So I want us to understand that yes, they are important, and no, we should not ignore them, and yes, they create harm, and we need to fight back against that harm. And also, we do not have a dictator or a king, and there are checks and balances, and there are organizations and people fighting very, very hard to ensure that the checks and balances hold, that the rule of law holds as these executive orders come down. There have been 5 executive orders that attack transgender people. And I'm going to talk about each one, and I'm going to talk you through what they say and what they do and what the status of them are right now. And then we'll talk about, in this environment where all of these things have happened, what are your rights as trans people or as folks who love trans people and support trans people. So the first one is sort of broadly should be thought of as like redefining what sex is and allowing discrimination based on sex or gender identity. The second one is about military service, access to gender-affirming healthcare, school censorship, and the sports ban. So we'll go through each one. And as Chase said, we want this to be a conversation. I cannot see the chat though. So Chase, I would invite you, if there is an urgent question, just to unmute and holler at me. Otherwise, if we can find a natural break in between each of the orders. And then please, as we talk about these, remind yourself this, take a screenshot or a picture if you need to remind yourself, no matter what the policy of the federal government is, we know the value, the dignity, and the humanity of our communities. There have been times in this country and in this world where doctors wouldn't care for us, where parents didn't support us, where the government did not recognize us, and we were there at that time, and we are here now, and no one can determine our worth and take that away. Let's look at the sex discrimination executive order. First, what it says, and I know this language is painful, but I think it's really important that we are clear about what we are up against. So this is language from the actual EO. It's the policy of the US to recognize two sexes, male and female, not changeable and grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality, right? So this executive order directs all of the different branches of the federal government, those agencies, to rescind any guidance that is inconsistent with this mandate. And this is really so an attempt to undo progress that has been made, because under President Obama, under President Biden, we had a tremendous amount of progress in guiding federal agencies to understand that the definition of sex, where we say discrimination against sex isn't allowed, where Department of Health and Human Services says we can't discriminate on the basis of sex, that includes transgender people, and in fact, in many cases, includes queer people. So this is an attempt to redefine sex and gender and change the way the executive branch enforces sex discrimination protections against LGBTQ people and rolls that back. That is the aim. And one of the most acute ways that this has been done, because when an executive order starts, it gives a timeline that the agencies have to do this. But one of the first things that happened, like almost instantly, is impact to federal government issued identification documents. And this directs those agencies that do that, so Secretary of State and the other agencies, no longer to allow changes on passports. So this is your gender marker change. You can no longer change your passport to reflect your gender. You can no longer change your passport to say X. Any pending applications are on hold and not being processed, right? So where I can tell you, I want to make sure that I'm clear, where have changes gone into effect and where have they not? Because a lot of the executive orders have a process that they have to go through that includes public comment, that includes a chance for us to weigh in and look at drafts and everything. And so some things have not gone into effect. This is an example of something that has gone into effect. My colleagues at the ACLU have filed a lawsuit to block this provision, and they petitioned the court for preliminary injunction. What a preliminary injunction is block the enforcement of this executive order while the case goes on, because lawsuits, as you may know, take a great deal of time before we actually know the result in the final ruling. So we have not been granted a preliminary injunction. That is to say, a judge has not said, stop this from being enforced. So it is still being enforced right now. What the administration has said is that current non-expired passports, including those with X markers, remain valid. So if you have already changed the gender marker on your passport, it should remain valid. Now, trust right now is hard to come by for this administration. I'm telling you what has been said. Another provision of this sex discrimination executive order impacts people who are in federal custody, that is, people who are in federal prison or people who are in immigration detention. And this directs that those folks be housed according to their sex and that they not be given access to gender-affirming healthcare while they're in prison or while they're in immigration detention. Two organizations I'm a big fan of, National Center for Lesbian Rights and GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. They also go by GLAAD. They have filed lawsuits, and this policy is currently blocked from being implemented, right? So a judge has said this provision should not be enforced at this time. It is likely unconstitutional or in violation of federal law. Do not enforce it at this time. So that is good news and what we hope to see under this executive order. Now, remember that these are just the two pieces that we already know have been implemented, or at least attempted to be implemented. And of course, this part is blocked. All as the other agencies look at how they're supposed to implement Trump's order, we may see more changes and more lawsuits, right? Because we've got Department of Health and Human Services or Department of Defense, or all these departments are now looking and saying, how do I implement what Trump told me to do? Right. So I'll do a quick pause. Again, I can't see the chat. Chase, I'll ask you if there is a question you want me to take now. Ask me. If you want to save them for later, that's okay too. I'll take a quick pause and a sip of water while you mull that over.
I think we've had a few questions here about the pace, just generally the pace of executive orders, sort of the rapid fire that we've been experiencing. Has this been normal? I did a quick reply of an Axios comparison article that has a chart that shows you. But if you have any sort of commentary on sort of the rapid pace, and then we do have a specific question around passports and gender marker changes. If you'd like to hear that also, I'll let you decide.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we know is a reality in the second Trump administration is that during the first Trump administration, he felt incredibly hamstrung by the bureaucracy of the federal government, that his agenda was blocked by, for example, processes that are required in law when executive orders come down and you have to go through this whole process. So a lot of the harm in Trump 1 was blocked simply by folks at like the ACLU, folks at work that work at other organizations engaging in the comment processes, using lawsuits to delay, doing effective advocacy. So we know that Trump came into office committed to not letting that happen again and to really pushing his agenda. And so the pace has been intense. I also think strategically, from their perspective, it is meant to overwhelm us. It is meant to make us feel like we can't keep up and that there's nothing we can do. The other thing is that because of Project 2025, there was a very clear set of policies, right? Trump is not a policy wonk, but he doesn't have to be anymore because he has been provided with a blueprint called Project 2025 and installed all of the architects and authors of Project 2025 into his administration. So he's able to move much faster due to all of those factors. What is the question about passports?
Specifically, has there been any notion that any passports with X or with an updated gender marker are going to be confiscated?
There has been nothing reported that has happened. Now, people have had it confiscated if they send it in now. If you were to send it in now and try to get it updated, we are concerned that it will not be returned. But we have not heard reports that somebody traveling, shows their passport, at the airport or whatever, and has that passport confiscated. We have not heard reports, and there's been nothing in the executive order that directs TSA or the folks at the airport, I guess that's TSA, to do that. Great question.
Yeah, it is. That's helpful. And I know that there are still some unknowns. I mean, I'm out here also, as a trans man who has a passport that reflects, M on there, and thinking about that renewal date coming up and what's going to happen. And there have been reports of trans folks, unfortunately, who have gone to renew their passports and it has been flipped back. And they weren't X gender markers. They were, binary, either female or male gender marker. But it's probably a good time to plug, though, the ACLU tip line for that sort of information. ACLU is gathering reports from folks that are having any experiences like that. We can find that link and put it in the chat if that's, or is that more just to be shared? I don't want to put
No,
it
that is
broad.
absolutely to be shared. And I can try to find it in a
We can
bit.
we can do that. You do you, and we'll get the link.
Fabulous. Yeah, and of course, the hope again is that the lawsuit that we have filed ends up blocking future enforcement of this. So if folks can hold off, hold off. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Know Your Rights section. Okay, let's talk about military service. This executive order has some of the most disgusting language of any of them that I have seen. And so, warning for what's on screen and if you were to read it. But essentially, there is language that calls transgender service members, 15,000 of whom are currently serving, dishonorable, untruthful, undisciplined, lacking humility and selflessness. It is absolutely disgusting language in this executive order, and not at all what military leaders have been saying for many years. This executive order directs the Secretary of Defense to develop a plan to ban the appointment, enlistment, induction, and retention of transgender service members. So the expectation is once this is implemented, you'd be prohibited to join the military as an openly trans person or with a gender dysphoria diagnosis. I think the key question here is whether current service members will be forced out of the service and lose their benefits. And as I said, about 15,000 folks are currently serving, and about 2,000 of them had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria as of a few years ago. This is a super reckless executive order, and this is a case of constant flip-flopping that is not unusual with executive orders. You had under President Obama allowed transgender service. President Trump took away transgender military service. President Biden put it back. Now President Trump is attempting to take it away. So how that doesn't weaken our military, I'm not a military guy, but it seems pretty clear to me that this kind of policy making does nothing to serve our interests, and is in fact meaning that we're turning away and potentially kicking out of the military folks who are skilled and trained and committed and amazing and all that kind of stuff. There is a lawsuit challenging this executive order by our friends at GLAAD and NCLR. There's another one by another set of organizations, Land Illegal and the Human Rights Campaign. And these are before a judge now. Judicial hearings began last week. The judge hasn't blocked it yet because the deadline for the Department of Defense to issue its plan is like next week. And so the judge has said, let me get this plan and everybody be ready for hearings on the plan quickly. So the hearings have gone quite well. The Trump attorneys are not doing a great job defending this executive order. So I feel hopeful that this will be blocked from implementation. And again, I say blocked. When I say it, it's all temporary, right? This is only a preliminary injunction, which pauses implementation and enforcement while the longer case proceeds. But to get a preliminary injunction, you have to prove that you are likely to succeed in getting the law struck down as unconstitutional. So you are kind of proving your case. So even though it's temporary, it tells us a lot about how the federal judges are thinking about our likelihood of victory. And if you're wondering why lawsuits take so long, they start at the district court, which is, we have several districts in South Carolina. Every state has several districts. Then they go to the circuit court, and each state are part of a circuit. We're at the Fourth Circuit, and then they go to the Supreme Court. That's assuming that they're appealed all the way through. Oh, I should pause and ask. Any questions about military service?
Sorry, I was on mute, but no, we're good to go.
Perfect. Access to gender affirming care. I know this is on a lot of folks' minds. I saw the questions that people submitted when they registered. So we can absolutely talk about this. Again, I pulled some language. It is disgusting language, talking about us and this mistaken idea that children are being mutilated. And the impetus is to declare it as the policy of the U.S. not to fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support gender transition for people under 19. This 19 number is quite strange, and none of us quite figure out why it says 19, and all of these state laws, for the most part, say 18. So what the executive order does, first, it tells our insurance companies, the federally run insurance programs, to exclude coverage. So we're talking about TRICARE, Medicaid, and the federal employee health plans. It attempts to shut down gender affirming care for trans people nationwide. So that would be including in states where it's permitted. And the way it does that is through federal funding, right? So if you are in a state like Massachusetts that requires gender affirming care, you won't get federal funds if you are a provider of that care. It threatens prosecution for healthcare providers who do it. It attempts to coerce medical institutions by, again, cutting off not just federal funding for like Medicaid, but also research or education grants. It's a threat to providers in those states, and about half the states do provide gender affirming healthcare, and about half the states do not provide gender affirming healthcare. This I'll come back. I want to talk about South Carolina's law, but this has been temporarily blocked. So the ACLU and Lambda Legal challenged this executive order, and attorneys general from Washington, Minnesota, and Oregon also challenged the order. So two separate lawsuits, and a judge has blocked enforcement. Right. So again, the big piece of it is the federal agencies withholding the funds. And so we have seen some providers in states. There's a big provider in Chicago that has cut off care. This block from the judge should restore care, right? What we have to be really worried about is providers over complying, saying, this is too politically fraught. There's too much in the air. The Trump administration is going to pull our funding. We can't deal with this. We're just going to back out. Now, we have seen some of those healthcare institutions come back online with their care after the judge blocked it. But this represents a tremendous amount of advocacy, not with legislators, but with providers, that in many cases we haven't had to do because providers have been on our side, the ones saying, don't cut off this care. We're not talking about the providers themselves. We're talking about hospital insurance people, hospital attorneys, hospital, risk assessors, right, who are saying this is too politically volatile. Hopefully the judge's order will bring a lot of that care online. As many folks probably know, even without this executive order, which is blocked, we do have a law in South Carolina that prohibits or at least restricts a tremendous amount of access to gender affirming care. So it is all care for folks who are under 18, and it also prohibits public funds, which impacts public employees, people who are in state custody, like in our state jails and prisons, and folks who are on Medicaid. So we do have a terrible law on the books here. ACLU of South Carolina filed a lawsuit against this law. Meredith, if she's not already on the call, will be on the call soon, is our lead attorney on this case. This case is being stayed. That means it is paused until the United States Supreme Court rules on Scrimeti. That is the case out of Tennessee. They have a similar law. So we're not going to get a ruling from our judge until the Supreme Court of the United States makes their ruling. I know there are probably a whole bunch of questions about this, so let's hear a few of them, Chase.
Well, actually, I mean, we don't have at this moment. I'm not seeing any questions that have been. There's a lot of conversation here, but no specific questions to that. But it was brought up before you mentioned it that the MUSC piece of the stopping providing care, and obviously know they're part of that suit that was filed. And but I don't see any questions at the moment. I'll just keep holding.
Great. Yes, please. If folks have questions, please ask about them. I mean, what MUSC and Roper are examples of overcompliance that we have also seen in other states, right? This is a direct result of our government threatening folks who disagree with them. It is a very troubling turn of events, not just about trans folks either. It is the squashing of political dissent and many things that I care about, the ACLU cares about, that many of you likely care about as well.
Sort of an existential question here in the chat. Max asked, well, Max said, I know that the Fourth Circuit appeals have already overturned laws similar to this. Why do our lawmakers pass laws when there already exists precedent for them to be overturned?
Oh, great question. When lawmakers are considering laws, they will hear from folks like the ACLU. We're known for suing people, but we actually have three folks who spend all of their time at the State House standing before lawmakers and saying, hey, these are the court decisions that might make you want to rethink this because this is probably unconstitutional. Abortion is another example. School vouchers is another example. Our South Carolina lawmakers are absolutely willing to pass laws that have been struck down even by their own court judges that they put into place. They do this for lots of reasons. The most jaded version of me thinks that they do it because they don't really care about these laws and they are doing it for political points. They are using trans people as political pawns. It doesn't really matter if the courts strike these down because it is what they get to tell their constituents that they believe are super anti-trans, that they did a thing, that they protected kids from this mutilation. They did their job and they can blame the courts. Certainly, there are true believers at that State House. There are people who believe in their heart of hearts that trans kids should not get this health care. And I think for many folks, this is the result of trans people being made to be political pawns. Sorry for that very jaded take. Let's talk about school censorship. You're probably not surprised to hear school censorship came up in an executive order if you've been watching what's happening at our State House and in places across the country. And when you think about historically, schools are the place where like civil rights battles are fought. When we think about segregation, when we think about the teaching of evolution, when we think about sex education, many of our most heated political battles happen at school because there's such a connection between government and school and our public schools. And you can see some of the language from the EO here. Parents have witnessed schools indoctrinate their children in radical anti-American ideologies, right? So there's this belief that teachers and librarians are indoctrinating children in these ideologies, namely, and I think it's really important to note, this isn't just an anti-LGBTQ executive order. This equally attacks any sort of teaching about systemic racism and the reality that the historic and present day reality of racism in our society. Right? So this is as anti-Black and as anti-people of color as it is anti-LGBTQ. And again, because this is what executive orders can do, it directs agencies, right, to do something. And that is to identify federal funding sources and streams that go to schools that do what they think are being done, supporting or subsidizing gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology. And it says, find all this funding and take it away, right? Get rid of it. And so this is really going to look at K through 12 curriculum, instruction, programs, activities, teacher training, certification, all of that stuff. So what we don't know, right, is how does this get implemented? Are we talking about GSAs getting pulled, can't have a school GSA anymore? Can you have, so will it go to clubs? How does it come apart with curriculum and instruction? What has changed about the way teachers are trained? So there's a lot that we don't know about all of these really, but especially about this one. The other thing that this does, and this is especially angering, is it tells the Attorney General to try to push this agenda in states too. So coordinate with state attorney generals and attorneys general. I cannot say that plurally correctly. And try to essentially go after schools in places that are pushing this ideology. Again, a lot that is unknown here, but this sets up a process and we will see how it plays out. So there's not a lawsuit here. I think if I'm reading the tea leaves, I believe there will be a lawsuit. It just may not happen until there's a plan so that we know what the harm will be and how to prove that harm is unconstitutional, right? So I think what we are going to see is identification of these federal funding sources and then that federal funding being pulled away. So, for example, will this lead to no more scholarships for Black and Brown students? That like there are some huge signs of government overreach here that I really think will be fought out in court. The other reality, the other reason why this one is unclear isn't just because it was directed to, do a plan and we don't have the plan yet, but also like it was poorly written. It's quite unclear how schools can even like abide by this, right? Like, because schools are not brave places most of the time. So with the threat of federal funding, schools will fall in line, but they have no idea how to stay in line themselves. And so it's a poorly written and unclear executive order on its face. Also, we haven't yet seen agencies acting on this, like pulling. Now there are other executive orders that we have already seen the agencies beginning to reach out to higher ed, but that some of those executive orders are being blocked in court. Again, I do think we will see lawsuits here as this continues to play out. If folks have been watching, a lot of the school censorship stuff happens in our state as well. So if this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night and gets you fired up, there are lots and lots of ways to plug in locally to school censorship efforts that I'm happy to tell folks about.
Some
Lastly
of
is,
that, I was just
oh,
going to say,
yeah, go
there is
ahead.
some of that discussion happening in the chat, and Mary Foster is in the chat, and just want to plug all the work that, and there, Mary put it in there, Freedom to Read, all the, Pro Truth. There's a lot of different groups here that are doing work in this space, and Mary is a great resource. So if you have questions about how to plug into that work, Mary is a great first person to start talking to.
Could not agree more. And thank you, Mary, for letting folks know how to plug in locally. There's a lot to do. Okay, let's talk about the last one, which is a sports ban. What's so infuriating about the sports ban, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is like the people who write the sports bans didn't give a damn about women's sports, before they wrote these laws, and they're using this, made up concern about women's sports just to harm trans people. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. So what this does, it essentially directs the rollback of President Biden's rules, which are not long-standing, in fact, and were hard to get to and somewhat imperfect, honestly, but it rolls them back. So as to say that transgender girls specifically and transgender women cannot play women's sports. I think what's even more nefarious here is that it wants to push this policy as far as it can. So the NCAA has already agreed it wants to push it into the Olympics and beyond the sort of purview where, which is to say public education, where the government lives and breathes. It wants to push it out and even requires the Secretary of State to promote it internationally. So when you look at the landscape of this issue, we've got 23 states that currently have policies that permit trans students to participate in athletics. So this forces states then to keep trans students from competing. And again, it tries to push entities that are not like public education, even K, and K through 16 is what I heard somebody say the other day. I'd never heard that. K through 16. USA Swimming, USA Soccer, and Olympics. They want pushing them to adopt these discriminatory policies. For folks who've lived here a while, you know that South Carolina prohibited trans students from participating in sports through a state law enacted in 2022. So just as like a reminder of how vicious these attacks are, 500,000 students play NCAA sports and 10 of them are trans. And so the attack is so targeted. There is a lawsuit on this executive order as well. It is currently being enforced. It has not been blocked in the courts, but glad that our colleagues are there to do this. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute, let folks get in any other questions, and remind us all that trans people matter. Organizations are fighting back hard. And look, we are not going to win every fight. We have some good things happening, though. We have things that are being blocked. We will win some things, and we will delay others, right, until better people are in office. That is, I usually complain a lot about how long lawsuits take. And sometimes lawsuits taking a long time aren't that bad when you're trying to wait out somebody who's in office. And so, even though we've got these lawsuits that, especially if they're blocked while the lawsuit continues, if the law cannot be enforced while the lawsuit continues, let's let the lawsuit take all the live long day, right? Let's get some better people in office if we can. So, we will win some of these fights. We will protect our community, and we do matter. Remember that. I'll pause for questions before I do the sort of pivot to how you can, what your rights are in this environment and how to advocate for them. What questions are there? And I can actually maybe figure out how to look at the chat if that would even be helpful. Any
There are,
questions?
yeah, there are some questions here, or at least one, and I'm trying to read it myself while I talk at the same time. Max said, I noticed the language is obviously gender essentialist, i.e., men and women, all female, locker room, etc. Does this mean if the executive order that strictly defines gender along assigned at birth lines is found unconstitutional? Does this executive order then turn into a nothing burger? Since I'm legally a female, I belong in an all-female space unless the strict definition of male-female is found to have standing. I don't know if
Yeah, that I lost that thread a little bit.
I know, I did too, and I was reading it. So, and
If
it's
you want me
probably
to take
because
a stab at it?
yes, please, thank you.
Oh,
Okay.
good. Hey,
Meredith's
introduce
here. Yay,
yourself.
Meredith.
Hello, everyone. I am so sorry that I had to come late. I had an obligation this evening, but my name is Meredith McPhail. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU South Carolina. I'm afraid me jumping in here won't add much more clarity than we already have. I'm gonna give the quintessential lawyer answer, which is that it really depends on kind of the
Classic
basis.
lawyer.
Classic lawyer. There has to be a lawyer joke about that somewhere. I should learn it and be able to deliver it. But it really depends on kind of the grounds on which the EO is struck down and how it's being applied elsewhere, and would those grounds also apply to the other EOs? And so at this point, the answer is we don't really know yet, which I understand is really not helpful at all.
But it was an answer, Meredith, and we're just glad you're here. So thank you.
Thank you for having
Yes,
me.
Meredith,
I'm
I
happy to
told
be here.
everyone that we had a phone a lawyer friend calling in. So we're glad you're here. We'll keep questions coming in the chat. I pulled up the chat and saw all the great conversation, which overwhelmed me a little bit, so I closed it again. So we'll have to let Chase give voice to any questions, but I love that folks are conversing in the chat because I think one of the sort of morals of the story here is that things are changing remarkably fast. And what we know we have to do is take care of each other. That is absolutely the case when the government turns its back on us, that we have to take care of each other. And that is what is happening right now. Okay, let's talk about your rights. I want you to know them so you can assert them. Many of these changes have not gone into full effect. So be willing and prepared to advocate for yourself. What that means is like, if you've got documents, take them places with you that maybe you weren't sure that you needed to take them, or just be prepared to like really speak who you are and advocate for yourself. You are still protected under our civil rights laws, right? Trump's wrote an executive order that says sex means this, and wants to push discrimination against trans folks, the president cannot change our laws or our court rulings, right? So if you believe you have been discriminated against at work or in housing, you can speak to an attorney. You can seek for your rights to be upheld. They are still protected under our civil rights laws, right? So there is that thing link that Chase is going to find for you on how to tell the ACLU. We're not going to probably help you with your employment lawsuit, your housing. That's really for like passports and some of these direct executive order problems. So if you feel like you've been discriminated against at work or in housing, speak to an attorney. As I said earlier, impacts to identity documents have taken effect. I think one thing I saw in the chat, it's not just passports, that's our most common one, but visas, any federally issued identification document is at play here. So the advice that we're giving people, and I know this can be hard to hear, is that if you have a valid current US passport, you should not try to renew it or attempt to change your gender marker right now. Again, we hope that this part of that executive order will be blocked in the courts, but it is not right now. And so I would encourage people to not try to get it changed at this time or even renew. Now, you may still be able to change your gender marker on your state-issued ID. That is a process I'm not an expert on. There may be experts on this call about that process. But this is executive orders about federal documents, not state documents. Also, just a reminder, you can still change your name by going through family court. Oftentimes folks get an attorney because it's not super easy here in South Carolina. And I would encourage you to be cognizant of the fact that updating your identity documents with your new name, it could be complicated, and you could end up with a passport that has one name and gender and a state ID that has a different name and gender, and just it could complicate your travel. So I would especially encourage working with an attorney right now, given the state of things, given what we are unsure about, how quickly things are changing. But name changes are a separate process than gender marker changes done through the family court and not touched by any current state law, and not restricted by any current state law, and not restricted by any current executive order. Gender affirming care. So Trump's order has been blocked. Now, South Carolina's law is still there and is currently being enforced. So if you are in South Carolina, you have a right to gender affirming healthcare if you are over 18. Prisma is still providing gender affirming healthcare. Planned Parenthood is still providing gender affirming healthcare. I think there are other providers in the state who are still providing gender affirming healthcare for folks who are over 18. You still have a right to that care as long as that executive order remains blocked in the courts. Now, you may not have coverage of that care. So if you have Medicaid, if you're a state employee and you have that plan, your insurance may not pay for that care. That does not, just because your insurance doesn't pay for it doesn't mean you can't get it. You just have to pay for it, which obviously is a reminder. The way oppression works is those of us who are living at the intersections, that is to say those of us who are trans and lower income, always harmed more. That is the case here. If you are under 18 or you love someone who is under 18, you can seek out care from providers based in other states. So, right, as long as those providers are not over complying with a blocked executive order, and so the Trans Youth Emergency Project can help you find care from those providers. For lots of stories from folks who are figuring this out through telehealth or through some travel, again, reminding us that folks who are low income and trans are the most likely to or most harmed by these laws and these attacks on trans folks. Schools in South Carolina are not welcoming to transgender students. They are prohibited from playing sports due to our 2022 law and our law on gender affirming care, H 4624. It requires administrators to inform parents if trans kids ask for changes to their names or pronouns. So a trans kid could be outed if they go to a teacher and ask to be called by a different name or to use different pronouns. I also want to share that many schools do not allow trans kids to use restrooms or locker rooms that align with their gender identity. They say they do that because there's a state budget proviso that prohibits them. Budget proviso is kind of like a law. It's like a piece of law-ish that's put into our state budget. And essentially it says, you can't, schools won't get money if they let trans kids use the restrooms that are best for them. That budget proviso is being challenged by our friends at AFFA. It still remains to be enforced, but there is some really strong case law, federal court decision that struck down a similar law. So folks can advocate for their rights. There is a leg you have to stand on. It's called Grimm. Meredith can tell us more about it. But there's some really strong case law that protects your right to use restrooms and locker rooms that affirm with who you are. And I think in a lot of cases for kids, with parental support, schools are willing to consider other ways to support trans youth. They are willing to call kids by different names if the parent's okay it. They are willing to use different pronouns if the parent's okay it. They are potentially willing to consider a single stall restroom usage or that sort of thing if parents will advocate alongside their kids. And probably if you're a parent on this call, you're willing to do that. Fortunately, there are lots of kids out there whose parents will not advocate alongside them. Those are the folks we want to make sure we're getting to support other kinds of supports, community supports. Lastly, you heard me say this already, we have to take care of each other. We have a government that has turned its back on us and is actively attacking us. And I'm 42. I've been doing trans rights work since 2010. And that was right around the time when these changes were first starting to happen under President Obama. It was really more in his second term than in his first. So I have lived through a time when the federal government did not recognize and affirm trans people and have witnessed that change and am now witnessing the rollback. It is incredibly painful. It is incredibly harmful to see that kind of work be undone because it took a tremendous amount of advocacy to get what we have. And this is far from over. We will absolutely fight back. We are fighting back. And we have to take care of each other because trans people have always existed. Long before insurance covered our care and before parents were supportive and before the government recognized us, we were here and we remain. Happy to answer more questions, but I think for now, I'm going to turn it over to Chase and let somebody else do the screen sharing part. Take it away.
That's great. And I thank you, Chase. I mean, that was an incredible amount of information and exactly what I was hoping to hear tonight. And so I think it was probably very helpful for a lot of folks. There was a question here in the chat from Lindsay that was about maybe a recent case, and it's above my pay grade. So I'm glad we've got the lawyer on the line. Going back to insurance coverage, wasn't there a recent case that said there wasn't a justifiable reason for excluding gender-affirming care from insurance plans, or that arguing cost was not a valid argument? Meredith, I don't know if that rings a bell.
The short answer is yes. But the longer answer is that the gender affirming care ban or funding ban that's been in place in South Carolina has been challenged in court, but our challenge has been stayed, which essentially means that the court is waiting to hear the outcome of Scrimeti, the Supreme Court case. Like Jay said, court cases often move really slowly, and we have Grimm, which is about bathroom uses, and we have other cases that are about insurance from the state, state-sponsored insurance, and we're fighting really hard to make sure that those cases are enforced in South Carolina, but it can be a really drawn-out process. The short answer is yes, but we're still having to fight the fight.
And Meredith, correct me, so a bunch of states have these laws prohibiting care, and Scrimeti is the case out of Tennessee. So that was the one that got to the US Supreme Court the fastest. But if you heard of rulings along the way, that's because pretty much every state that has this has a lawsuit. And so different judges in different states and different circuits, there are all kinds of rulings out there. But at the end of the day, we're waiting now on the big dog. Is that all right, Meredith? That correct me if I'm off.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to kind of contextualize Skermeti. So that's the case that's in front of the Supreme Court now, which is about care for minors. And so it really depends on how the Supreme Court answers that question about how it's going to impact coverage for care for adults, how it might impact other related claims that aren't being raised in front of the court in this particular posture at this particular time. Um, Again, it's really not at all a satisfying answer, but it's kind of a wait and see and really hope for the best, which is rough. Yeah, I wish I had something better to say.
Even if it's not the answer that we would hope to hear, it's still something. So I appreciate that and always appreciate your expertise in this. So while we're sort of opening up this time, of course, if you have a question that you haven't asked already, please feel free to drop this in the chat. And as we are sort of thinking about sort of reflecting on our time here together, I mean, everything that Jay shared, really even in the final slides there, I think really summed up, what advocating for ourselves really looks like. And just want to, I think for me, I just want to hold on to just a couple points that knowing your rights, which is what you're doing here today. You're learning and sort of absorbing some of this information. Knowing the resources that you have here on the screen, you can see there are lots of resources out there. We shared the link to the ACLU site that if you know of issues or concerns around gender marker or passport issues, that's that sort of thing that you can report those things. Know your resources. There are organizations out here, particularly around these legal issues, that are out here fighting the good fight, and knowing who they are. And we have an amazing ACLU affiliate here in South Carolina with an incredible team of people here who know this state and are fighting for us. And so, I want to just lift them up as incredible support and resources for folks here in our state. And obviously, continue to use your voice. Um, that can get really exhausting, though. I'm guilty of the fact that I am a part of an organization and we're sending emails out all the time asking you to contact the legislator, show up at the state house, do this, do that. And of course, we want people to be engaged. And one of the big reasons we do that, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, it really can have an impact at times. But also, we have people reaching out to us saying, what can I do? What can I do? And we want people to feel like you have an avenue where you can take action, where you can be involved, and you can lend your voice to the fight. But I also want to give you the flip side of that, which is to protect your peace and to know what is right and good for you to do in this moment. And, as a trans man who has also been doing this work for a while, um, for the first time in a long time, I'm just really kind of struggling with this, sort of finding this sort of balance between now my professional advocacy work and how this, is directly impacting trans people and sort of what that means for me, my family, my loved ones around me, and my community. And knowing that, sometimes you just can't do it all, right? You can't show up to every hearing. You can't send a message to every legislator. You don't always have to do that. And I'm saying this like you need to hear me giving you that sort of permission. And that's not me thinking that highly of myself. It's more that I know that sometimes that's what I've needed to hear. That it's okay if it's best for your mental health, for your emotional security, for how you feel, to take a step back and to let others step forward. Know that that is okay. And I feel really confident that we do have a lot of really strong allies around us who are stepping up and stepping into the gap there to advocate. It's not me saying don't ever advocate for yourself or advocate on these issues, because of course we want you out there when it feels safe and good to do so. But also know that, you do what feels right and safe and good for you, and take care of yourself, because that is most important in this moment. And, continue to reach out to us and to other organizations like ACLU. There's so many fantastic organizations in our state. These are, the advocacy organizations, but, we have REN also here in South Carolina. We have a number of really incredible support organizations that are providing direct services to LGBTQ folks in our state. Reach out when you do need support and help. And if you aren't sure who to contact, always feel like you can contact us, and I'm happy to help connect you with resources. We don't want people to feel alone right now. Most of all, know that this is a tough time for many folks, and if you're in need of support, we will help you get that support. All right. I know there are some other questions that have been put in the chat. I don't want to cut anyone off if there was anything that feels like it needs to be addressed.
Yes, we have a hand up. Max, if you want to unmute and ask your question, that'd be great.
Yeah, this question's for Meredith, and I apologize in advance because I don't know the legal language, but is there not a legal situation that has happened, or maybe even multiple legal situations, where a court case is brought forward, but the crime is hypothetical, or that there isn't actually a true victimhood? I don't know if the word is standing. Um, it is standing. Okay, so what's your like lawyer view on like this? I don't want to call it a trend because it's not, I don't know, but what's your view on this strategy, this legal strategy to essentially construct straw people to then hold court cases against? Is this gonna hold? Is this gonna be a trend that continues? What's your thoughts on this?
Let me make sure I'm understanding your question right. So I think your question is, it sounds like you're concerned about people kind of pretending like they've been harmed by something to create a court case. Is that right?
Something like that. I think I remember this in the case of like baking gay cakes for weddings or whatever, where it was like no one was actually asked to do that, but it was like the fear and the hypothetical is what actually drove that to the Supreme Court at some point, if I remember
Yeah.
that correctly.
So that I believe was a First Amendment case, and standing in the First Amendment context is a little bit different.
Hmm.
Um, and so standing is essentially kind of like a prerequisite for even getting into federal court at all. So if there isn't standing, a federal court can't hear the case. And so standing essentially makes sure that there is a live case in controversy, meaning that there was a real thing that happened, and there's people on this side and there's people on this side, and they're going to fight it out. The theory being that when we have this adversarial approach to the legal system, that we end up getting the best result. We can spend a lot of time on whether or not that is actually true. But that is kind of a prerequisite. That's what we talk about when we talk about standing. But it is something that you have to prove in court. So it can't, as a case progresses, you have to continue to show, when to meet your burden of proof, to say,
Hmm.
I have been harmed here. And how courts apply that in specific cases, there's a giant body of law about that specific issue, but it remains true that there has to be an injury
Hmm.
to get into federal court in the first place.
Okay,
Does that kind of help?
that does help. It does. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat that I want to make sure I ask, which is, and it's asking for my opinion, which I love to give. I also love to give advice. Fun fact, which is, do we think that trans people will be denied other forms of care, like not gender affirming care, but other like emergency care? And the way these policies are written is very, very targeted to gender affirming care and attacking trans people. In fact, like our state law, for example, makes sure that puberty blockers are still able to be given to kids with precocious puberty, but not to trans people, right? That's why they're so discriminatory. But like it is, the laws and the EO even are quite targeted toward gender affirming care, not I broke my arm and need health care, or I have cancer. So, we're living in a time when things are changing very, very fast, but if I was reading the tea leaves, I don't think that that's what is next. That it's that it's we don't treat trans patients here. I think it's about a very specific kind of care that is being restricted.
And just to maybe give a little bit of assurance on the specific point about emergency care, there's a statute, EMTALA. It's kind of come up in the abortion context and been tested in the abortion context, and we don't 100% know how it's going to shake out there. But I think the acronym stands for Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. And it essentially means like if you show up at an emergency room and you have a medical emergency, the hospital must give you care. So that protection remains right now.
Great information. Any other questions as we close this out? I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I wish I would have asked that one question, but I didn't type quickly enough.
If I could just address one thing that's in the
Yes.
chat. So the case out of Virginia is Cadell. And I'm saying that in like the most southern way possible. I don't actually know how it's actually pronounced, but that was largely about state coverage for adult care. And so it kind of depends on Jason's totally right that Skerbetti may have an impact, likely will have an impact on Cadell or Cadell. And we don't know exactly know what that is yet. So it could be what level of scrutiny must a law like this survive? Like what tests do we ask in court? It could be we don't really know kind of there are a lot of different permutations of what the Supreme Court could do, and it likely will affect Skermeti, but we don't know how much exactly. I mean, Cadell. I really think it's Cadell.
I love that pronunciation.
That's what I'm going with.
I feel great about it too, Meredith. Yeah. So the folks who are in the chat asking questions about that, hopefully that helps. And I think unfortunately it's what's hard to keep up. And as a non-lawyer, this was hard for me too. I'm like, it feels like the courts already said this wasn't okay. And you're like, so why do they keep passing these laws? And why do we have these courts saying they disagree and it makes no sense and it's infuriating? And just know, yes, I agree. All of that. It makes no sense and it's infuriating and it seems to be part of the process. So I'm not sure there's a way to make it make sense.
Yeah, it feels really kind of like frustrating when it's like we've been here before, like we already said this is wrong, like why are we here again? But it's almost like they're kind of just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, and it takes a lot of resources and a lot of time to like fight these things, a lot more than it takes for them to just kind of willy-nilly do them. But yeah, it really sucks.
The question there about when is the anticipated decision on Skermeti?
We're thinking that it's likely going to be June. So you'll probably remember every like late June, super early July, maybe even is when we kind of get all of the really controversial, really big Supreme Court decisions. That's kind of how they traditionally do it. And I think that we're anticipating it to be June. But it could be any time, but that's what we're thinking is likely to happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Meredith and Jace, again for really providing the backbone. I was just here to set up a Zoom link for the most part, but really just so grateful for your expertise and all that you were able to bring into this conversation tonight. Jace, thank you. Yes, the pretty face. Exactly. That too. The Zoom link and the pretty face. That's on my LinkedIn profile. The things that I bring. to my work. But just so grateful for the work that you all are doing here in South Carolina, fighting for our rights and such important work that honestly, I'm not sure who else is doing this for our community here, and we're just grateful to have you, and so lucky to have you on this call tonight to be able to field questions. And again, just want to thank everyone else for joining us and reach out. We are here to be a support and a resource. If you ever have questions, while I probably won't personally know the answers, I'm always happy to help make connections for folks and to get you the support that you need. Um, Stay connected to each other and take care of each other and know that with our community together, we are stronger and we will get through this and we'll come out on the other side. So thank you so much again for joining us and take care.